November 13th, 1942, 0148 hours. The waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, a stretch of ocean that would be forever known as Ironbottom Sound. Captain Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Amatsukaze, his knuckles white against the railing as the night exploded into cascading walls of fire. Through his binoculars, adjusted to the dim red combat lighting of the bridge, he watched American destroyers and cruisers firing their main batteries with what seemed like reckless abandon, salvo after salvo, the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness in a continuous strobing pattern that turned night into a hellish approximation of day. Hara had trained for 15 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had memorized the ballistic tables for every gun in the fleet. He knew, with the precision of an accountant, that the destroyer he commanded carried exactly 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in her magazines, that each shell cost the equivalent of 3 months' wages for a factory worker, that the Navy's annual shell production could not replace even a single major engagement's expenditure. He counted his shots. Every Japanese officer counted their shots. It was doctrine, drilled into them at the Naval Academy at Etajima, reinforced in every gunnery exercise, codified in every tactical manual. Fire deliberately. Fire accurately. Make every shell count, because there would not be more. The Americans, Hara observed with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror, were not counting. They were firing as if their magazines were bottomless, as if shells grew on trees, as if the very concept of ammunition conservation was alien to their thinking. In the next 90 minutes, Hara would watch American ships fire more rounds than some Japanese destroyers carried in their entire peacetime load. And this wasn't desperation fire, wasn't the panic of untrained crews. The Americans were hitting targets. They were sinking ships. They were simply doing it while expending ammunition at a rate that violated every principle of Japanese naval warfare. What Hara couldn't know, as he gave orders to his gunnery officer to target carefully and fire only when a hit was probable, was that he was witnessing the opening demonstration of the single most decisive factor in the Pacific War. Not tactics, not courage, not even technology, but industrial capacity so overwhelming that it transformed the very philosophy of warfare. The Americans weren't firing without thinking. They were firing without worrying. And the difference between those two states of mind, multiplied across every engagement, every battle, every campaign of a 4-year war, would prove more devastating than any weapon system or strategic innovation. This was the arrival of logistics as a weapon system, abundance as a tactical doctrine, industrial might so complete that it allowed American forces to treat ammunition expenditure the way other nations treated target practice. The mathematics of this disparity had been established years before the first shot was fired, in the foundries and factories and railway systems of two nations whose industrial capabilities existed in different universes. In 1941, the year Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Japanese steel industry produced 8 million tons of steel. The American steel industry, that same year, produced 82.8 million tons, 12 times more. But raw steel was only the beginning of the equation. The conversion of steel into shells required specialized factories, precision machinery, chemical plants for explosives, transportation networks to move raw materials and finished products, and electrical power to run the entire system. Japan, in 1941, operated 17 major ammunition plants with a combined monthly capacity of approximately 850,000 artillery and naval shells of all calibers. The United States operated 127 major ammunition plants, a number that would grow to over 300 by 1943, with a combined monthly capacity that reached 2.4 million shells by early 1942 and would peak at 8.7 million shells per month by 1944. These weren't comparable industrial bases. They were different species of industrial organization, one evolved for scarcity and the other engineered for abundance. Consider the 5-inch divided by 38 caliber dual-purpose gun, the standard destroyer and light cruiser weapon for the U.S. Navy, and its Japanese equivalent, the 5-inch divided by 50 caliber Type 89. The weapons themselves were roughly comparable in performance, Both could fire a shell weighing approximately 50 pounds to a range of about 10 miles with similar accuracy. But the ammunition supply chains behind these weapons existed in parallel dimensions. A Japanese destroyer of the Kagero class carried 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, 100 rounds per gun for her 6-gun main battery. An American destroyer of the Fletcher-class carried 650 rounds per gun, for a total of 3,250 rounds for her 5-gun main battery, more than 5 times the total load of her Japanese equivalent. This disparity extended to every caliber. Japanese cruisers carrying 8-inch guns typically stored 100 to 120 rounds per gun. American cruisers, with 8-inch guns, carried 150 to 200 rounds per gun. Japanese battleships, with 14-inch guns, carried approximately 100 rounds per gun. American battleships with 14-inch guns carried 130 to 150 rounds per gun, and the newer 16-inch gun battleships carried 100 to 130 rounds per gun in magazines designed to be rapidly replenished. But the real disparity wasn't in the magazines. It was in the magazines behind the magazines. When a Japanese destroyer expended its 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, resupply required returning to a major naval base Yokosuka, Kure, Sasebo, or Truk, where ammunition was carefully rationed from limited stocks that could not be quickly replaced. The average turnaround time for a Japanese destroyer to return to base, rearm, and return to operational status was 12 to 16 days, and this assumed ammunition was available at the base. When an American destroyer expended its 3,250 rounds, which happened with surprising frequency, it could replenish at any one of dozens of forward supply bases, floating ammunition ships, or even from other destroyers in the task force, often within 24 to 48 hours. The U.S. Navy operated 157 ammunition ships by 1944, purpose-built vessels carrying nothing but shells, powder, bombs, and torpedoes. The Japanese Navy operated 11. The Americans had designed a logistics system where ammunition was so abundant that it could be treated as a tactical consumable. The Japanese had designed a system where ammunition was a strategic resource to be carefully preserved. This philosophical difference manifested in training with consequences that rippled through every engagement. At the Japanese Naval Gunnery School at Etajima, student officers fired an average of 8 live rounds per training course. 8 actual shells over months of instruction with the rest of their training, conducted using subcaliber practice rounds or pure drill, without firing at all. The emphasis was on calculation, on measuring range precisely, on waiting for the perfect moment, on making each of those rare live rounds count. At American naval gunnery schools in San Diego, Newport, and Norfolk, student officers fired an average of 145 live rounds per training course, with additional practice available upon request. The American philosophy was volume of fire creating hit probability. If you fired enough shells at the target, the law of averages would produce hits regardless of individual accuracy. The Japanese philosophy was precision creating efficiency. If you aimed perfectly, you needed fewer shells. Both philosophies were internally consistent. Only one of them worked when tested against the friction of real combat, where targets maneuvered, where range estimates were approximate, where smoke and darkness and fear made precision difficult or impossible. Captain Hara would later write, in his post-war memoir Japanese Destroyer Captain, the observation that would crystallize this disparity. The Americans used shells, like a rich man uses money, without thinking, without caring, simply assuming more would always be available. We used shells like a poor man counting coins, calculating, rationing, always aware that each expenditure brought us closer to empty magazines and helplessness. In the end, the rich man's approach proved superior, not because it was wasteful, but because it allowed a freedom of action we could never match. This wasn't an admission of poor training or inferior tactics. This was an acknowledgement of a fundamental asymmetry that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. The Americans could afford to miss. They could afford to fire on uncertain targets. They could afford to saturate an area with shells because their industrial base treated each shell as essentially free at the point of use. The Japanese could afford none of these things. Every shell fired was a shell that couldn't be easily replaced. Every miss was a permanent reduction in combat capability. Every engagement that failed to sink enemy ships was a net loss, even if they avoided losses themselves. The Battle of Guadalcanal, where Hara had his revelation, provided the first large-scale demonstration of what this disparity meant in practice. Over the course of 6 months of naval engagements around the island, the battles of Savo Island, Cape Esperance, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, and numerous smaller actions, the U.S. Navy expended approximately 87,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, 16,500 rounds of 6-inch ammunition, 8,900 rounds of 8-inch ammunition, and 1,200 rounds of 14-inch and 16-inch battleship ammunition. The Japanese Navy, over the same period and in the same waters, expended approximately 19,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, 3,200 rounds of 6-inch ammunition, 2,100 rounds of 8-inch ammunition, and 380 rounds of 14-inch battleship ammunition. The Americans had fired 4.5 times more ammunition, and this ratio would prove typical throughout the Pacific War. More remarkably, after the Guadalcanal campaign ended in February 1943, the U.S. Navy's ammunition stocks were higher than they had been in August 1942 when the campaign began. Production had not just replaced expenditure, it had exceeded it. The Japanese Navy's ammunition stocks, by contrast, had been drawn down to approximately 60% of their pre-Guadalcanal levels and would never recover. The human experience of this disparity created psychological effects that Japanese accounts would reference repeatedly. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator who participated in numerous campaigns, recorded his observations after witnessing the bombardment of Japanese positions on Rabaul in November 1943. The American ships fired for 7 hours continuously. 7 hours. We counted more than 12,000 large-caliber shells landing on the airfield and harbor facilities. Our defensive positions, built with great effort over months, were obliterated. But what struck us more than the physical damage was the implications of the expenditure. How large must their ammunition reserves be that they could afford to fire 12,000 shells at a single target? How vast must their production capacity be that they felt no need to conserve? We realized we were not fighting a nation. We were fighting a factory, a machine that produced shells faster than we could count them. The industrial architecture behind this machine was itself a form of military achievement. The United States, between 1942 and 1945, produced approximately 41 million artillery and naval shells of all calibers, not including small arms ammunition, which totaled another 47 billion rounds. This production required 6,200 specialized workers at each major ammunition plant, 840,000 tons of steel, allocated specifically to shell casings, 2.1 million tons of TNT and other explosives, 47,000 railroad cars dedicated to ammunition, transportation, and enough electrical power to run the entire operation continuously. The logistics of moving this ammunition from factory to front was its own engineering marvel. Shells manufactured in Iowa had to reach destroyers operating off Okinawa, requiring coordination between railroads, cargo ships, supply depots, ammunition barges, and underway replenishment vessels. The U.S. Navy developed the techniques for underway replenishment, transferring ammunition from supply ships to combatants, while both vessels were moving to a level of efficiency that allowed a Fletcher-class destroyer to take on 2,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in 45 minutes without either vessel stopping. The Japanese never developed comparable underway replenishment capabilities. Their ammunition came from fixed bases or not at all. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the ultimate demonstration of what happened when these two philosophical systems collided in the largest naval engagement in history. The U.S. Navy brought to the Philippines a total ammunition load across all participating ships of approximately 1.9 million shells of all calibers, an amount equivalent to the entire Japanese Navy's total remaining ammunition stocks. During the 3 days of battle, American ships fired approximately 340,000 shells. Japanese ships fired approximately 51,000 shells, a ratio of nearly 7-1. But the raw numbers only begin to tell the story. American ships fired until they achieved their objectives, then stopped because the targets were destroyed, not because they were running low on ammunition. Japanese ships, in multiple instances documented in action reports, broke off engagements, not because they were defeated tactically, but because they had expended 60 or 70% of their ammunition, and doctrine required them to retain a minimum reserve for the return voyage and potential additional engagements. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force during the Battle off Samar, made the fateful decision to withdraw from what appeared to be a devastating victory against American escort carriers. Multiple factors influenced this decision, but one that appears consistently in Japanese accounts is ammunition expenditure. Kurita's heavy cruisers and battleships had fired intensively during the engagement, and his flagship Yamato, carrying the largest guns ever mounted on a warship, the 18.1-inch Type 94, had expended 49 of her 100 rounds per gun, 51 rounds remaining. For the largest battleship ever built, with the most powerful guns in existence, 51 rounds per gun represented a number that Japanese doctrine classified as minimum combat reserve. Kurita could have continued the engagement, could have pursued the escort carriers to destruction, but doing so would have left his battleships with perhaps 30 or 35 rounds per gun, and if he then encountered the American fast battleships, which he believed were in the area, he would be fighting at a crippling disadvantage. So he withdrew, preserving his ammunition, following the logic of scarcity that had governed Japanese naval thinking since the fleet was created. An American admiral in the same situation, with the same force composition and the same tactical picture, would not have withdrawn. Not because American admirals were braver or more aggressive, but because an American battleship with 51 rounds per gun remaining was still considered to be at full combat capability. American doctrine classified any battleship with more than 30% of its ammunition load as combat-ready. The magazines could be refilled tomorrow, or the day after, from the ammunition ships that accompanied every American task force. The mathematics of abundance created a different calculus of risk. Kurita was fighting with a spreadsheet in his head, constantly tallying rounds expended against rounds remaining, calculating whether he had enough for the next battle and the battle after that. American admirals fought with the assumption that ammunition was, for practical purposes, unlimited at the operational level. Both approaches reflected the industrial realities behind them. Only one reality included the capacity to fire 340,000 shells in 3 days and have higher ammunition stocks at the end of the battle than at the beginning. The Battle of Okinawa, from April to June 1945, represented the final and most complete expression of American ammunition abundance as a weapon system. The U.S. Navy, facing kamikaze attacks that required sustained defensive fire, expended an average of 300,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition per day during the peak of the fighting, more ammunition in a single day than the entire Japanese Navy had fired at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The destroyer USS Laffey, during a single 2-hour engagement on April 16, 1945, fired 3,200 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, her entire basic load, plus an additional reload she had taken on that morning. When the battle ended, with the Laffey damaged but still afloat, having survived attacks by 22 kamikaze aircraft, an ammunition ship came alongside within 6 hours and replenished her magazines completely. The entire cycle expend all ammunition, receive more ammunition, return to combat took less than 12 hours. A Japanese destroyer that expended its entire ammunition load would be out of action for a minimum of 10 days, likely longer. The psychological weight of fighting against an enemy who appeared to have infinite resources appears repeatedly in Japanese accounts from the war's final year. Lieutenant Haruki Iki, serving aboard the cruiser Yahagi during her final sortie as part of Operation Tengo, recorded in his diary on April 6, 1945, the day before his ship was sunk. "We depart with 65 rounds per gun for the main battery. The Americans will come with hundreds. We depart knowing that every shell we fire diminishes our capability permanently. The Americans know that every shell they fire will be replaced before they return to port. How do you maintain morale when you know the enemy doesn't have to count his bullets, while you must count yours? How do you fight with confidence when conserving ammunition is as important as hitting targets? We are not defeated by American ships. We are defeated by American factories. The ammunition disparity extended beyond the immediate tactical level to constrain Japanese strategic options in ways that compounded over time. The Japanese Navy, aware that its ammunition could not be easily replaced, developed a doctrine that emphasized decisive battle, one massive engagement that would destroy American naval power and force a negotiated peace. This doctrine required conserving ammunition for the critical moment, which meant avoiding smaller engagements that might deplete reserves. The result was a strategic paralysis where Japanese ships remained in port, preserving their ammunition for the decisive battle that kept receding into the future as American power grew. The U.S. Navy, operating with ammunition abundance, could afford to fight constantly, engaging in small actions, bombardments, and patrol clashes that had cumulative effects far beyond their individual importance. American destroyers could spend a night firing at shore installations, expending 1,000 rounds, and be fully rearmed the next day. Japanese destroyers couldn't afford such expenditures, so shore bombardment missions were rare and limited. The side that could afford to fight every day eventually defeated the side that was saving its strength for one perfect moment. The production figures, examined in detail, reveal the industrial ecosystem that made American ammunition abundance possible. The Des Moines Ordnance Plant in Iowa, one of 73 major ammunition facilities built during the war, covered 3,626 acres and employed 18,000 workers at its peak. It produced 5-inch naval shells exclusively, with a peak monthly output of 240,000 rounds, approximately equivalent to the entire Japanese Navy's 5-inch ammunition expenditure for the entire year of 1942, and Des Moines was one facility among dozens. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot in Nebraska produced 8-inch shells. The Street Julians Creek Annex in Virginia produced 16-inch battleship ammunition. The Indiana Army Ammunition Plant produced 155mm artillery shells that could be used by naval guns. Across the United States, from Maryland to California, from Texas to Minnesota, ammunition plants operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, producing shells at a rate that exceeded consumption even during the most intensive periods of combat. The railway system that connected these plants to ports was itself a military asset of decisive importance. In 1944, the U.S. railway system moved approximately 840,000 tons of ammunition per month from factories to embarkation points. Japanese railways, operating with 1/10 the rolling stock and chronic coal shortages that limited locomotive availability, moved approximately 62,000 tons of ammunition per month from factories to naval bases. But even this comparison understates the disparity, because American ammunition plants were spread across the entire continent, forcing the development of continental-scale logistics, while Japanese plants were concentrated in the home islands, making them vulnerable to air attack and requiring much shorter transportation distances. When American B-29 bombers began targeting Japanese industrial facilities in late 1944, ammunition production collapsed, not just because factories were destroyed, but because the transportation network that connected them to ports was severed. By March 1945, Japanese ammunition production had fallen to approximately 30% of 1,943 levels. American production, the same month, was at 140% of 1,943 levels and still climbing. The training consequences of ammunition abundance extended beyond individual gunnery to fleet-level tactics. The U.S. Navy could afford to conduct realistic fleet exercises where ships fired live ammunition at target rafts, towed targets, and radio-controlled drone aircraft. The famous Turkey shoots, where American pilots massacred Japanese aircraft during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, were possible because American pilots had trained extensively with live ammunition, learning how to lead targets, how to calculate deflection angles, how to fire short bursts for maximum effect. Japanese pilots, by mid-1944, were receiving minimal live-fire training, often fewer than 10 hours before being sent to combat, because ammunition for training aircraft was being diverted to combat units. The same pattern held for ships. American destroyer crews practiced anti-aircraft fire constantly, expending thousands of rounds per week on training exercises. Japanese destroyer crews practiced with drill rounds and simulated firing, preserving their live ammunition for actual combat. When combat came, the Americans had muscle memory built from repetition. The Japanese had theoretical knowledge built from classroom instruction. Muscle memory proved superior. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the war's final year represented, in part, a response to the ammunition disparity. Japanese strategists calculated that conventional attacks against American ships were unsustainable. Pilots who returned from missions reported that American ships fired so much anti-aircraft ammunition that the sky appeared solid with explosions. The ammunition expenditure required to shoot down incoming aircraft exceeded the Japanese Navy's ability to resupply, so they adopted tactics that required aircraft to be destroyed to succeed, because those aircraft weren't coming back anyway. If you're going to lose the plane, you might as well lose it while hitting the target. The Americans responded with even more ammunition expenditure, developing a defense doctrine called layered fire, where multiple ships concentrated their anti-aircraft fire to create overlapping zones of destruction. The Laffey survived her ordeal, not through individual marksmanship, but through volume. Her crew fired continuously at every target, hitting some, missing many, but creating an environment where getting through the defensive fire required superhuman skill or luck. The economic calculations behind ammunition production revealed a disparity as devastating as the tactical one. The United States allocated approximately 8.5% of its wartime GDP to ammunition production, a substantial investment that still left 81.5% of the economy to produce everything else. Ships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, food, medicine, and consumer goods. Japan allocated approximately 17% of its wartime GDP to ammunition production, double the American percentage, and still produced less than 1/10 the absolute quantity. This wasn't inefficiency. This was the mathematical reality of an economy 1/20th the size trying to compete with an industrial giant. Japan's GDP in 1944 was approximately $61 billion in $1,944. America's GDP the same year was $1,380 billion, 23 times larger. Japan could allocate every yen to ammunition production and still be outproduced by American factories running at 25% capacity. The war wasn't decided by tactics or courage or innovation. It was decided by industrial capacity so overwhelming that it made tactical excellence irrelevant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet until his death in April 1943, understood this disparity with a clarity that drove him to despair. In a letter to a friend written in January 1941, before the war began, he wrote, "I have seen their factories. I have seen their cities. I have seen their farms. I know what we are about to fight. We cannot win a war of production against America. Our only hope is a short war decided by 1 or 2 decisive battles. If the war becomes long, if it becomes a contest of industrial capacity, we will be ground to dust beneath their output." Yamamoto's prediction proved exactly correct, but the political system he served couldn't accept it. Japan went to war assuming it could compensate for industrial inferiority with superior spirit, superior training, and superior tactics. For a few months in early 1942, when surprise and preparation gave Japanese forces advantages that temporarily masked the underlying disparity, this assumption seemed valid. But by late 1942, as American production ramped up and the true scale of the industrial imbalance became apparent, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan was fighting with 1,941 ammunition stocks. America was fighting with 1,942 ammunition production, and 1,942 American ammunition production exceeded all Japanese production from 1,930 to 1,941 combined. The Battle of Surigao Strait, the southern pincer of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, demonstrated what happened when Japanese forces operating under ammunition scarcity met American forces operating under ammunition abundance in a nighttime slugfest that evoked the old age of battleship combat. The Japanese force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura included 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, carrying approximately 90 rounds per gun for their 14-inch main batteries. The American force waiting in ambush included 6 battleships, 5 of them survivors from Pearl Harbor, back for revenge, carrying an average of 120 rounds per gun for their 14-inch and 16-inch main batteries. When the battle began at 0351 hours on October 25, 1944, the American battleships opened fire from ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, distances so great that Japanese guns couldn't effectively respond. The Americans fired 285 rounds of 14-inch and 16-inch ammunition in 18 minutes. The Japanese fired 44 rounds in return, not because their gunners were incompetent, but because they literally couldn't see their targets clearly enough to justify the ammunition expenditure. American radar-directed fire control allowed accurate firing in total darkness. Japanese optical rangefinders required visual confirmation before firing, and by the time they had visual confirmation, their ships were being torn apart. Yamashiro, flagship of the Japanese force, took at least 12 heavy-caliber hits in the first 10 minutes of firing. She fired 64 rounds in return, scored no hits, and sank at 0419 hours with most of her crew. Her sister ship, Fuso, was hit by torpedoes before reaching gun range and sank without firing her main battery. The entire engagement, from first shot to last, lasted 43 minutes and resulted in the expenditure of 285 American heavy shells and 44 Japanese heavy shells. The disparity wasn't just in quantity, it was in what quantity enabled. The Americans could afford to fire at maximum range, could afford to fire without perfect fire control solutions, could afford to saturate the target area with shells, because even if hit probability was low, volume would compensate. The Japanese couldn't afford any of these luxuries. They had to see the target clearly, had to calculate range precisely, had to wait for high probability shots. By the time those conditions existed, they were already sinking. Captain Hara's destroyer Shigure, the only Japanese ship to survive the Battle of Surigao Strait, expended 197 rounds of 5-inch ammunition during the battle, nearly 1/3 of her total load. After escaping, Hara recorded his observations in the ship's log with a precision that testified to his training. Observed American battleships firing continuously for 18 minutes without pause. Estimated rate of fire, approximately 16 rounds per gun. Observed no evidence of ammunition conservation. Obvious conclusion: enemy ammunition stocks are effectively unlimited at the operational level. Recommend all commanders abandon doctrine requiring ammunition conservation during decisive engagement. Ammunition conservation against an enemy who doesn't conserve is simply slow-motion surrender. This was a remarkable statement from an officer trained in a system where ammunition conservation was doctrine, almost religious in its importance. Hara was essentially recommending that the Japanese Navy abandon one of its core principles, because that principle had been rendered obsolete by American industrial capacity. But Hara's recommendation couldn't be implemented, because implementing it required ammunition that didn't exist. The Japanese Navy in November 1944 had approximately 2.4 million rounds of ammunition of all calibers in all magazines and depots across the entire Pacific. The U.S. Navy in November 1944 had approximately 19.7 million rounds in the Pacific theater alone, with another 12.3 million rounds in depots in the United States, ready to be shipped forward. If Japanese forces abandoned ammunition conservation and fought the way Americans fought, they would exhaust their entire ammunition supply in approximately 2 weeks of sustained combat. The Americans could sustain their rate of fire indefinitely. Production exceeded expenditure by enough margin that magazines got fuller, even during intensive combat. The disparity had progressed beyond tactical problem to existential crisis. Japan couldn't fight the way America fought, because Japan couldn't produce the way America produced. The options were conserve ammunition and lose slowly, or expend ammunition freely and lose quickly. Neither option led to victory. The air-sea battles around the Philippines in October and November 1944 consumed ammunition at rates that would have been incomprehensible to naval planners in 1941. On October 24 alone, during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft expended 1,600 500-pound bombs, 850 1,000-pound bombs, 340 torpedoes, and 2.8 million rounds of 50-caliber machine gun ammunition in attacking the Japanese center force. This was more ordnance than the entire Japanese Navy had expended in the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was one day of one battle in one campaign. American ships in the area fired an additional 67,000 rounds of 5-inch anti-aircraft ammunition shooting down Japanese aircraft. Japanese forces the same day fired approximately 14,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition. The Americans were firing at a ratio of nearly 5-to-1 in a defensive role, and this ratio held across the entire campaign. Volume of fire had become a defensive doctrine. If you fired enough shells, you created a steel curtain that aircraft couldn't penetrate. The Japanese, forced to ration defensive fire, created gaps in their defenses that American aircraft exploited ruthlessly. The mathematics of naval ammunition production revealed industrial capacity operating at scales that transcended anything in previous history. A single 16-inch shell for the Iowa-class battleships weighed 2,700 pounds, required 850 pounds of steel for the casing, 154 pounds of TNT for the explosive filler, and 600 pounds of propellant powder to fire. Manufacturing one shell required 47 hours of machine work, 23 hours of chemical processing, and 8 hours of quality inspection. The United States produced these shells at a rate of 4,200 per month during peak production in 1944, nearly 50 per day, every day, from an integrated system of steel mills, chemical plants, machine shops, and assembly facilities spread across 12 states. Japan, with comparable technical knowledge and similar manufacturing processes, produced 16-inch equivalent shells for their 18-inch guns on the Yamato class, at a rate of approximately 120 per month, less than 3% of American production for a weapon one caliber larger. This wasn't incompetence. This was the output of an economy operating at its absolute maximum capacity, and still being utterly overwhelmed by an opponent with 20 times the industrial base. The submarine war in the Pacific provided another dimension to the ammunition disparity. American submarines, operating primarily against Japanese merchant shipping, carried approximately 70 rounds of 5-inch deck gun ammunition and 24 torpedoes. Japanese submarines, designed primarily for fleet actions, carried approximately 30 rounds of deck gun ammunition and 20 torpedoes. But the real disparity was in resupply. American submarines operated from forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guam, and eventually the Philippines, where ammunition was plentiful and resupply was routine. Japanese submarines operated from increasingly isolated bases, where ammunition was scarce and rationed. By late 1944, Japanese submarines were often sent on patrols with partial ammunition loads, 16 torpedoes instead of 20 rounds of deck gun ammunition instead of 30, because the ammunition simply wasn't available to fill their magazines. American submarine commanders complained about bureaucratic delays in rearming between patrols. Japanese submarine commanders were grateful to receive any ammunition at all. The American submarines' surface action tactics, attacking merchant convoys at night, using deck guns to conserve torpedoes, were only possible because ammunition was plentiful enough to be used freely. Japanese submarines rarely used their deck guns because ammunition conservation was absolute doctrine. The result was that American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons, while Japanese submarines sank approximately 170 Allied merchant ships, totaling 800,000 tons. The disparity wasn't purely about ammunition. American submarines had better radar, better torpedoes after 1943, and better tactical intelligence, but the freedom to expend ammunition without concern enabled aggressive tactics that multiplied effectiveness. A submarine that could fire 50 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at a convoy knew that those 50 rounds would be replaced in port. A submarine that had to count every round knew that 50 rounds might represent multiple patrols' worth of ammunition. Different operational philosophies emerged from different industrial realities, and the philosophy built on abundance proved superior to the philosophy built on scarcity. In the war's final months, as American forces approached the Japanese home islands, the ammunition expenditure reached levels that seemed like a deliberate demonstration of industrial superiority. The bombardment of Iwo Jima before the amphibious landing consumed 38,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, 14,000 rounds of 6-inch and 8-inch ammunition, and 1,200 rounds of 14-inch and 16-inch battleship ammunition, over 3 days more heavy ammunition than the entire Japanese Navy had in its magazines by February 1945. The bombardment of Okinawa consumed even more: 7,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, 22,000 rounds of 6-inch and 8-inch ammunition, and 1,800 rounds of 14-inch and 16-inch ammunition before the first Marines set foot on the beach. These preparatory bombardments were intended to soften defenses, but they also served as psychological warfare, demonstrating to Japanese defenders that American industrial capacity was so vast that they could afford to fire thousands of tons of steel and explosives at empty beaches just to ensure those beaches would be safe for landing. The message was clear: you cannot win through attrition because we have more of everything than you can possibly destroy. Japanese attempts to counter this industrial superiority through technical innovation produced weapons of remarkable sophistication but insufficient quantity. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, widely acknowledged as the finest torpedo of World War II, could strike targets at ranges exceeding 20 miles, with a warhead containing 1,080 pounds of explosives. American torpedoes of equivalent period had half the range and 2/3 the explosive power. But Japan produced approximately 4,200 Long Lance torpedoes during the entire war. The United States produced approximately 65,000 torpedoes of all types, including eventually the Mark 14 torpedo, which, after its problems were fixed in 1943, proved highly effective. Quality couldn't compensate for quantity when the quantity disparity was 15-1. Japanese ships carrying Long Lance torpedoes could devastate American formations if they achieved surprise and close range, as they demonstrated at the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942, sinking 1 American cruiser and damaging 3 others while suffering only 1 destroyer lost. But those torpedoes, once expended, couldn't be easily replaced. American ships damaged at Tassafaronga were repaired and returned to service. Japanese ships that expended their Long Lance loads often waited months for resupply. The end came not with a single decisive battle but with a slow strangulation born of industrial exhaustion. By August 1945, the Japanese Navy had approximately 800,000 rounds of ammunition remaining for all ship types, less than the U.S. Navy expended in a typical week of operations. Japanese factories were producing approximately 40,000 rounds per month, assuming raw materials were available and power plants were operating and transportation networks were functioning, all assumptions that became increasingly questionable. As American B-29 seconds incinerated Japanese cities and mined Japanese harbors, the combined fleet, once the pride of the Japanese Empire, consisted of 1 operational battleship, Nagato, with approximately 30 rounds per gun, 3 operational cruisers, with an average of 40 rounds per gun, and 19 operational destroyers, with an average of 180 rounds per ship. Compare this to the U.S. 3rd and 5th fleets operating around Japan: 23 battleships, 40, 3 cruisers, 180, 7 destroyers, with average ammunition loads at 85% capacity and resupply available from 73 ammunition ships operating in theater. The ratio had progressed from unfavorable to hopeless to absurd. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the remnants of Japanese naval aviation in August 1945, recorded in his diary on August 10 after the atomic bombs, but before the surrender, a reflection that captured the Japanese Navy's final understanding: "We trained our pilots to hit with the first shot. The Americans trained theirs to keep shooting until something hit. We conserved our ammunition like misers. They expended theirs, like millionaires. We built a navy for a short, decisive war. They built a navy for a long, grinding war of production. We fought with excellence. They fought with abundance. Excellence wasn't enough. Looking back now, I see that we were defeated not on December 7th, 1941, when we attacked Pearl Harbor, but decades earlier, when America built the industrial infrastructure that made abundance possible. We never had a chance. We were fighting their factories, and you cannot sink factories with torpedoes. This was the revelation moment that Captain Hara had first glimpsed in 1942, and that the entire Japanese Navy had come to understand by 1945. The Americans weren't firing without thinking. They were firing without needing to think about ammunition supply, because they had solved the ammunition supply problem so completely that it no longer constrained their tactical options. The Japanese counted every round because they had to. The Americans fired without counting because they had built an industrial system that made counting unnecessary. This difference between necessity and choice, between scarcity and abundance, between constrained and unconstrained operations, proved more decisive than any tactical innovation or operational plan. The side that had to count rounds eventually lost to the side that didn't, because warfare at industrial scale is ultimately a contest of systems rather than individual battles, logistics rather than tactics, factories rather than courage. In the final accounting, the Pacific War consumed approximately 41 million tons of ammunition of all types: bombs, shells, bullets, torpedoes, rockets from all combatants combined. Of this total, American forces expended approximately 36 million tons. Japanese forces expended approximately 3.2 million tons. The remaining tonnage came from British, Australian, and Chinese forces. The Americans had used 11 times more ammunition than their primary opponent, and this ratio had remained roughly constant from 1942 through 1945. Every attempt to narrow the gap through tactical excellence or operational innovation or strategic planning had failed because the gap wasn't tactical or operational or strategic. It was industrial. It was the gap between an economy producing 82.8 million tons of steel per year and an economy producing 6.8 million tons. It was the gap between a nation with 127 ammunition plants and a nation with 17. It was the gap between a philosophy of abundance and a philosophy of scarcity. And abundance had won with the inevitability of mathematics, crushing scarcity beneath an avalanche of production that could not be matched, could not be countered, could not even be comprehended by those who had never seen anything like it. The lesson was carved into the ocean floor of Ironbottom Sound, written in the wreckage of ships that went down still counting their remaining rounds, demonstrated in every battle where Japanese forces withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because they couldn't afford to continue, proven in the final tally of a war where one side treated ammunition as a precious resource and the other side treated it as a consumable commodity. Captain Hara had seen it first in November 1942. Admiral Ugaki had confirmed it in August 1945. Between those 2 points lay the mathematical working out of industrial warfare's central principle. In a long war between industrial powers, victory goes not to the side that fights most efficiently, but to the side that can afford to be inefficient. The Americans could afford to miss. The Japanese couldn't. In the end, that difference decided everything.